Matthew chapter 7, and I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 29. It says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. And for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if the child asked for a fish, would give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? And everything do to those as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow, and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns, or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' Then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Go away from me. You behave lawlessly.' Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be a wise man who builds his house on rock. The rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now when Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, and he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." This passage is from the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I've talked about the Sermon on the Mount quite a bit the last few months. And it's because it's really good. Honestly, if anybody's struggling with confusion or overwhelm on what to do with the Bible, it just seems so confusing and difficult, I'd say just stick with the Sermon on the Mount for a while. Just camp out in that space. In fact, reading the sermon and then going over it again and again, really, you're not going to do much harm in doing that. You'll probably do more good than trying to put everything together. It's a really good place to start and get a good basis of understanding who Jesus is and the wisdom that he has for us. But I'm reading the end of this sermon, and I want to talk about the idea of discernment. In fact, this week and the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about discernment and what the Bible teaches us about that. So let's talk about that. What is discernment? I think if we understand the practice and what it means to be discerning, as indeed Jesus does instruct us to do at the end of this when he's talking about false teachers, I think if we understand that a little bit, we can be able to practice it. And I purposely read this much of the passage. I purposely started in verse 1 because I wanted to include those first 5 verses. And I'm going to read the first 5 verses with 15 through 19, just to kind of create a contrast for us to just start this discussion on discernment. So in chapter 7, verse 1, it starts, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And I wanted to include that with this part of the passage, starting in verse 15, where it says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. If we were just initially taking a look at those two passages, they seem almost contradictory. But the truth is that judgment is not the same thing as discernment. Judgment is about determining a meeting of a standard. It's deciding the worth of punishment or reward. And there is only one who can offer judgment, because there is only one worthy and able, and it is not any of us. Jesus alone is the only one who can offer judgment. We're not supposed to go around spending our time deciding who is good enough, who is worthy of reward, and who is worthy of judgment. But that's not the same thing as not paying attention at all. While we may be unable to determine if someone is worthy of punishment or reward, because that rests with Christ alone, we can determine if someone is trustworthy enough for us to listen to. And that is where discernment comes in. We are all in this ongoing process of development, developing our understanding, developing our faith, developing our practices and our habits. There's so many expressions of this throughout the Bible. We hear different terms. We hear terms like spiritual formation or spiritual development, but in the Bible, Jesus and other writers give so many examples and ideas, pictures of what this looks like. There's agriculture with gardening and growing, where vines and branches and gardens and fruit are used to describe what this process looks like. We also talk about the idea of building. And last week we talked about this idea of building and using Christ as the cornerstone. And when we fail to align with that cornerstone, we either may fall apart, be broken because of that cornerstone, or we may find ourselves needing to tear down and rebuild back up in line with that cornerstone. The use of this building imagery is again used even in this passage with the comparison of the man who wisely builds his life or his home on a rock that's trustworthy and stable, in comparison to the man who builds his house foolishly on unstable sand. One of my favorite images of this from the Bible, of how God works with people and we are molded and develop over time, is God as the potter and we are the clay. We are constantly being molded and shaped by his hands, and it is an ongoing process. We are with him, and we are being molded like clay by a potter. Sometimes we believe this lie that we're already fired in the kiln, we're already finished, we're stable, there's no need to change us anymore. We start to believe this lie that we're more like a stagnant, unmoving tower. We exist fully formed, but that's just not true. It's true that some of us might be more stubborn. It's true that some of us might be harder to work with, but all of us are still in this process of being molded and shaped. We're in this daily, ongoing process of developing and growing in our spiritual lives. And during this time, we have all kinds of voices and influences that are trying to determine how we are shaped. This is where discernment comes in, deciding who we allow to influence that process of our shaping. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, this idea of the struggle, where we have this constant bombardment of noise and words and ideas, and there's a constant influx of information that it just feels like a barrage all of the time. It's overwhelming, in fact. And as much as I would like to just go ahead and kind of shut all of it out, the truth is I can't. And as much as I would like to think that somehow I'm not affected by those voices, that they just wash over me and they don't leave their mark, the truth is that I am influenced. It doesn't work that way. We are influenced by what we choose to listen and what we let in. Choosing to listen to something is choosing to allow it into my mind. And once it is in there, it is harder to remove. And simply as a human being, I am prone to being misled as much as anybody else is. So this is the part in the sermon where sometimes a pastor might say, so listen just to me, and I'm going to give you a pre-approved list of all the resources that you can trust, and then that's it. But I'm definitely not going to say that. One, I really do want you to listen to other voices. There are some wonderful, God-honoring, and beautiful things being said out there, and man, it would be super boring and very sad if I suggested that you miss out on them. Second, I'm not going to say that because that is not what the Bible teaches. That's not what Jesus tells us to do. Jesus, in fact, here in this sermon, gives us the truth on how to discern who we allow into our ear and into our mind and who we are to avoid. Because listening and shutting something out is something we do need to do sometime. That's not judgment, that is discernment. We're not condemning or affirming. Instead, we're deciphering who is trustworthy enough to help in that process of shaping us. And that is a key distinction in this process. So here's the tricky part. There's just so much all the time. Information, ideas, suggestions. This sheer volume is overwhelming. So the tricky part is, how do we sort it out? How do we weed through? How do we see what is good and what is better left actually to be left alone, to be ignored? The way most of us sort it out is, sometimes this is even what we are taught to do, is we examine the words. We look at the ideas. If they're good ideas, if we agree with them, if they seem good in our eyes, if they confirm how we already kind of think and feel and they're good to hear, those are the things we should listen to. But unfortunately, that is not what Jesus tells us here. He's not saying, I'm not saying don't ever listen to words or test them. I'm not saying for you to ignore a gut reaction you might have. I'm just saying that is not the best indicator, and that is not what Jesus teaches us to do. Because if we listen to someone and we test their ideas based on the words and based on what we respond to them with, whether we agree with them or not, we cause two problems. One is we never grow beyond our current understanding. And two is we're never able to find correction when we are wrong or mistaken. There's two phrases that are used to describe these two ideas. One is this term echo chamber. Has anybody heard this phrase, echo chamber? An echo chamber is in large part something that's more visible to us now because of how the algorithms in social media operate. If you like or spend time looking and reading and responding to something in social media, the formulas that dictate what you see next are designed to give you more and more of that same kind of material until all that shows up in your feed is more and more of just the same kind of thing. The same thing can happen in how we select what we read or what news station we pay attention to. If we're only able to hear the words that we already agree with and we're unable to hear anything new, we end up in this echo chamber. There's no space for growth or development. It is just an endless cycle of the same thing on repeat. The second phrase that kind of talks about this same idea and the damage of when we just look at words to evaluate them is confirmation bias. Has anybody heard this phrase? Confirmation bias? This is the idea that, it's kind of an idea that we all kind of work with, is that when you hear something that you already agree with, it's validating. And when we live in this space where we're constantly looking for things that validate what we already think, we are unable to hear correction if we are mistaken. When we hear things we already have a tendency to agree with, we go, see, I'm right, because I'm hearing it again. Somebody else thinks the same thing and agrees with me. That's what confirmation bias is. And while it is very validating and it's encouraging to hear when others agree with us, what happens when we are mistaken or if we're wrong? If we shut out any voices that might offer correction or a better view, we just get stuck in this endless cycle of validating our own ideas even if we're wrong. So this is why we have a need for discernment that looks outside simply looking our response to people's words. We have to have something that deciphers for us who to listen to and who to ignore that's beyond our immediate impressions. But this is the part that I think is amazing about what Jesus says. Jesus doesn't say to primarily or first look at the words and ideas. He says to look at the source of where they come from. He tells us, look at the source. He doesn't tell us to look at the words. He tells us to look at the person who is speaking the words. And he doesn't say to look at their appearances, because he goes on to that. Many people will do many great things, and I will say, I never knew you. We don't look at how people are dressed, how they project themselves, the list of accomplishments that they offer. He tells us to look at their fruit, and he makes it super simple. A good tree will produce good fruit, and a bad tree will produce bad fruit. Look at the fruit, and let that guide you on if you should listen or not. And I'm not sure when Christians started using this fruit idea to suggest worldly accomplishments, but that isn't what Jesus meant. He didn't say, go ahead and measure how big their church is, or how many books they've written, or how many followers they have on YouTube. In fact, I can't even imagine that coming out of Jesus' mouth. I can't imagine him saying, make sure that you vet a preacher by if they have at least 500 people in their sphere of influence, and they have an annual ministry budget of 5 times the average annual salary. Those things are not fruit, and that is not what Jesus was talking about. So then what is? Well, we can see explicitly from John 13:5, where Jesus says, by this will everyone know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. That's a picture of what Jesus is talking about. Love is a picture of fruit. What other kinds of things do we think that Jesus would indicate is a good way to tell if we trust somebody enough to allow them to be a part of our spiritual shaping? Well, Paul gives us this great list in the Galatians: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And I can see that coming from Jesus. I can see him saying, vet a preacher by how they treat other people. Are they patient? Are they good? Are they steadfast in their faith of who God is? Do they show some self-control? Would you trust them with your children? Would you trust them with your vulnerable things that are going on in your lives? Would you trust them with your pain? Would you trust them to tell you the truth, even if it wasn't easy? If yes, then there is somebody who is able to show good fruit in their lives. Doesn't mean that they're perfect. Doesn't mean that every word out of their mouth is flawless, but it does mean that there is good fruit coming from a good tree. When I think about this, it becomes quite clear. And since I have been practicing this kind of discernment in my own life, I can attest that it has been a game changer in how I learn and grow from others, how I am able to be so encouraged and challenged by voices that draw me closer to God. So let's go ahead and say, okay, we can agree with this. We can say there's value in this premise that discerning what to listen to and what to disregard is not about words or ideas. It's about examining the fruit of the source of those words and ideas. There is a practical issue that we can sometimes run into, and that's because examining fruit can be difficult. After all, it takes a while that you spend enough time with someone to be able to even see what their character is, to even have a chance to see what their fruit is. And in some cases, for instance, if you're reading a book or a written word on a blog or something like that, or if you're listening to someone primarily through videos or podcasts, the truth is we might not be able to see that fruit at all. So what do we do in those cases? What do we do in those scenarios? And I think it's good, first of all, to recognize that this is a limitation. It's not a terrible idea for us to have some limits and barriers when it comes to allowing someone to speak into our life and we don't have a relationship with them, when we can't be close enough to them to be able to see their fruit. Because this is what Jesus did. This is how he modeled. He spoke to many people, and many times he spoke to strangers. But those that he had the greatest influence over was those that he was in relationship with. They spent time with him. They knew him. The kind of growth that happened in that relationship was far beyond just his influence during teaching. That kind of growth can't happen in a one-directional, media influence kind of relationship. It's good for us to practice that too. And when it comes to those who do speak to us via a means that we can't be in relationship with them, doesn't mean that we're left without resources there either. And I can share my own process with this because I really enjoy reading, and I find a great value in being able to read and hear from other people deep truths and things that challenge me and grow my faith with God. Many of these people have passed. Even if I wanted to try to reach out to them, there would be no way for me to sit with them and know their fruit. But one thing I can do is I can pay attention to the fruit of those who listen, who are influenced by these same people, and who recommend them. There's a person that I know and I have great respect for them. I have a great deal of trust in them. They show consistent character. They show deep love and grace. And they recommend an author to me, someone that's spoken to their lives. I really, really pay attention to that. Meanwhile, if there's somebody who's just wildly popular and they're praised by many, many people, but it seems like most of the people praising them seem to be struggling with fruit in their own lives, even if they're nice enough people, even if they're successful people, but their fruit is lacking, then I kind of take that recommendation with a grain of salt. This is not the only teaching that we are offered about when it comes to discernment. We are given other resources, and we are going to continue for the next 2 weeks looking at other tools we can use for discerning who we allow to speak into our lives. But I want to close with one other promise that we are given from this same Sermon on the Mount. Jesus promises us in verse 7, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if your child asked for a fish, would give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" Our God is a good God, and he wants good things for us. If any of us ever find ourselves struggling with not knowing who to listen to or who not to listen to, when we should ignore and when we should dig in, we just need to ask him, and he will give us a good answer. Please join me in prayer. God, we are grateful for the time that we live in. There's so many gifts and resources and blessings that we have at our disposal, but it also means that we are inundated every day with so much noise, so many voices crying for us to listen to them, so many things that are constantly asking for us to pay attention. And those words seep into our hearts, seep into our minds, and they shape us. And so you have given us truth from over 2,000 years ago that gives us the ability to be able to know when to listen and when to go ahead and just ignore those voices, to put them on silent, to shut them down and put them away. You've given us good advice that we can be able to see beyond ourselves, that we are able to trust in you to offer us a good path forward. And we pray that we learn ways to practice this, because we won't get it in a day. But give us opportunities to learn how to see this fruit. Give us guidance. Continue to answer our prayers when we seek and we search and we look for your wisdom in our lives, God. We're grateful that you are a God who loves us so much that you give us these gifts, you give us these truths for our good. We pray that we are able to enjoy the blessings that they are in our lives. We are grateful for this. In your name, amen.